Welcome into the Fantasy Football Diagnostics Podcast, where we provide you with your weekly diagnosis of everything fantasy football. Whether it's season-long leagues, dynasty, DFS, or sometimes even IDP, we got you covered all year long. Let's do it. Let's get to it. Welcome into the Fantasy Football Diagnostics Podcast. I'm your host, Jon Jeune, at the real Jon J _FF on both Instagram and X. Now, as I mentioned on the Tuesday waiver wire show, this weekly matchup show will not be recorded live. So if you're in the chat, you don't see me responding, it's because I'm not actually recording this live. This is a pre-recorded show. Also, for that reason, forgive me if there's anything that I say here that ends up becoming outdated, let's say for injury concerns or, any other thing that pops up, weather related, things like that. Let's just be, please forgive me on that. And lastly, there's some construction happening outside my window that I have zero control over. So forgive me for any background noise that you may hear. All right. I'm going to try to run through this relatively quickly. Again, this is the matchup show where we look at quarterbacks and tight ends that are outside that top 10 that we feel like should be inside potentially that top 10 or could even provide in some, deeper leagues, could provide some value there to you, or even, for in terms of quarterbacks, super flex leagues. And then looking at those running backs and those wide receivers that are outside the top 20 that could provide some value there for you, either as a flex play or maybe they should be treated as higher than what they're currently ranked at inside that top 20. Now, also what we're going to get into starting this week, I said I would, is looking at some guys that are maybe inside those groups, running backs, wide receivers inside that top 20 or quarterbacks, tight ends inside that top 10 that have some trepidation about for one reason or another, whether it be the matchup, whether it be recent production, whether it be a combination of both. So we'll talk about, I think there's one guy on the list that fits that criteria today. But as always, guys, make sure you're commenting, liking, subscribing the show, whether it's on, whether you're watching live on YouTube, Twitch, X, Instagram Live, or if you're listening on podcast platforms, wherever you may be listening, just make sure you're subscribed there as well. Now, this is the week 4 matchup show. And, let's talk about what happened last week in the matchup show. We had, it was not the greatest week, right? Had 3 guys beat their ECR by 10 or more spots. 4 guys beat their ECR by 10 or more spots. We had 6 guys of the 16 that beat their ECR outright. And then obviously that means we had 10 guys that missed, and we had 7 guys that just absolutely flopped. Yeah, 8 guys that just absolutely flopped for us. So not my best week, but as I mentioned, process over results, and just, that's part of me too, right? Just making sure that I'm looking at my process, refining it, so that I can come in here and give you guys the best possible advice that I can give you. But in terms of what we did hit on and what we missed on, Bo Nix was the ECR quarterback 30. He ended up finishing as the quarterback 12, so provided a QB1 week there for you if you went ahead and started him. Jon Jennings, ECR wide receiver 55, obviously had a big week, finished as the wide receiver 1 in PPR leagues, the player 1 overall. Khalil Shakir, ECR wide receiver 35, finished as the wide receiver 18. Austin Eckler, the ECR running back 31, finished as the running back 16. And then those were our big hits. And we had 2 just, regular hits, guys that beat their ECR. Stephon Diggs, wide receiver 22, finished as the wide receiver 15. And Justice Hill, this one feels a little dirty, so I'm actually not going to really count this one. But Justice Hill, running back 46 on the ECR, finished as the running back 41. And then we had a bunch of big misses, as I mentioned at the top, 7 big misses. Deontay Foreman, 41, finished at 77. Jerry Jeudy, 40, finished at 51. DeAndre Swift, 24, finished at 45. Derek Carr, 14, finished at 29. Rashid Shaheed, 27, finished tied for 118 with a big fat 0. George Pickens, 28, finished at 43. And Zamir White, 26, finished at 54. Oh, and then Jameson Williams, 21, finished at 113. The Jerry Jeudy one, I do feel, the process was right there. I will say that. The targets were there, just didn't come through, and Amari Cooper ended up coming through with the touchdowns there. So, I'll still continue to play Jerry Jeudy out there in leagues where I have him, and I would suggest that you do the same. But obviously, your teams, your lineups, feel free to play it how you want. In terms of the misses, Chiga Kwankwo, 27, finished at 33. That's just terrible. Geno Smith had a good first half. That game wasn't very competitive at all. Was the ECR quarterback 15, finished at 22. And then Carson Steele, 34, finished at 36. That one, again, I have a feeling we might talk about him later, but I felt like the process was right there as well. As he, operated as the workhorse back there for the Kansas City Chiefs. So, as I mentioned last week in the matchup show, this week right here is one of my favorite weeks because we are in week 4 and we have 3 weeks worth of data from this season to work with. You will no longer hear me referencing anything from last season in terms of fantasy production allowed to a position. It's going to be what have these teams allowed this year in 2024. And we're going to keep that trend going, mostly because if you've listened to me in the past, I'm constantly referencing what's happened over the last 3 weeks, because I break the season down into chunks. I'm not looking at season long, data. I mean, I will at times, right? And you will hear me reference it at times, but most of the time you will hear me reference what's happened in these last 3 weeks, what's happened in these last 4 weeks, because these teams are adjusting and they're making changes and they are trying to get better. Or sometimes teams suffer injuries. Maybe their schedule had something to do with it, their matchups. So you would see, maybe a dip in some of their production. Actually, I guess what I'm trying to say is like they might allow more fantasy points because of those things than they were if you just were to look at the season as a whole. So without further ado, let's jump into the first guy we're going to talk about today, and that's Cincinnati wide receiver T. Higgins. He's the ECR wide receiver 29. Higgins has probably left a bad taste in the mouth of fantasy managers since going back to last season. He dealt with a few injuries last year. Had to deal with the quarterback situation after losing Joe Burrow and going down to Jake Browning, and then starts off this year with the hamstring injury, misses the first 2 games, comes back in week 3 in a cake matchup against Washington, and didn't really provide the value there for us that we would have hoped. But he was involved in last week's game, seeing 6 targets, including a couple of red zone targets as well. I assume that he'll resume his regular role within this offense as the clear second option behind Jamar Chase in no time. And why not this week against the Carolina defense that allows the 13th most PPR points to the wide receiver position? Moving on to the next guy on this list, New York Jets tight end Tyler Conklin, ECR tight end 16. Conklin had his first productive game of the season and now gets a matchup against a Denver defense that allows the 11th most PPR points to the position. And while the Jets kind of sort out their pecking order, I genuinely believe Garrett Wilson will be that number 1 target. Mike Williams will be the number. I guess Breece Hall will probably be that number 2 target. Mike Williams will see a lot of the deep ball production, and have some games where he ends up as that, as a top 2 target for the Jets. But Tyler Conklin, I feel like, will be a constant third behind Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson. So I feel like Conklin, we were hoping to get some production out of him in the first couple of games. That didn't happen, but we saw what it looks like in week 3 against the New England Patriots. where Conklin was able to get involved with 6 targets. So had 93 receiving yards. I don't think he'll repeat that this week, but I think the target should be there, and the matchup here is favorable as well. And now we talked about a guy that we might be a little down on this week, and for me, that's New York Jets wide receiver Garrett Wilson. ECR wide receiver 12. I think 12 is a bit bold for Garrett, who's been mostly underwhelming as defenses have keyed in on him to start the year. And I think that'll ease up as, the matchups get a little bit better. I mean, they've played some good corners in Travarius Ward and L'Jarius Sneed, and they had Christian Gonzalez last week, but he's got another one coming up this week with Patrick Surtain II. Right, so PS2 and a Denver defense that allowed the least amount of PPR points to the wide receiver position. I'm tempering expectations for Wilson in week 4. I'm not saying I'm benching him. That's not what I'm saying at all, because we often talk about, we talked about it with George Pickens a few weeks ago. If he's seeing those targets, 29% of the targets, 30% of the targets, well, right now he's seeing 29%, then I'm going to be willing to go into the teeth of a defense for a wide receiver that's seeing that much volume. But I would try to look for some more upside at the wide receiver position or in my flex to help balance out what I'm expecting to be a not the most productive game for Garrett Wilson, who, again, as I mentioned at the top, has been a little underwhelming to start the season. Moving on to the next guy on this list, Derek Carr. It was a rough week for Derek Carr, right? He's the ECR quarterback 18 in this matchup against Atlanta. And those who counted on him in week 3, they came away less than impressed, right? Definitely a flop for Derek Carr. But he matches up against an Atlanta defense that allows the 14th most points to the position this year. The Saints are slight dogs, and there should be a little back and forth nature to this game. I do like Carr to finish as a borderline QB1, if not right in that QB1 territory. I feel like this ECR holds a lot of weight considering what happened last week. Moving on to this next matchup between Minnesota and Green Bay, Romeo Doubs, ECR wide receiver 47. This passing attack is a lot better with Jordan Love under center, and there's no denying that. And now Doubs isn't the flashiest of the Green Bay wide receivers between Jaden Reed and Christian Watson or even Dontavius Wicks, but he leads this wide receiver group in snaps played on the year, and in his only game with Jordan Love, he saw 7 targets. I like Doubs to be productive again if Love starts this week against Minnesota, and a Minnesota defense that, while good, has allowed the 10th most PPR points to the wide receiver position. Moving on to the next matchup, Jacksonville against Houston. Jacksonville wide receiver Brian Thomas, ECR wide receiver 30. Thomas has passed the eye test every single week. He looks like the best wide receiver on the Jacksonville Jags, and they seem pretty bad, which means possibly a lot of negative game script here and lots of throwing the football. Thomas saw 9 targets last week, which was a season high, and now gets a matchup against a Houston defense that allows the 12th most PPR points to the position. Seems like a great spot for Brian Thomas Jr. to finish inside that top 24 at the wide receiver position this week. Moving on to the next matchup between the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Indianapolis Colts. And I'm going back to my guy, George Pickens, ECR wide receiver 26. The Indianapolis defense has been bad all year. I've talked about that in regards to Justin Fields earlier in the week in the waiver show, who I wanted to pick here, but he's currently the quarterback 10, so couldn't go with him. So Pickens is the answer here for me. He's missed out on some opportunities this year between penalties and him and Fields just missing on some connections. But this matchup is really good. Indianapolis allows the 5th most PPR points to the position. I'm all in on Pickens, as you already know, but especially this week. Moving on to the next matchup, LA Rams against the Chicago Bears, and give me Rome Odunze, the ECR wide receiver 33. Finally had his big game last week against Indianapolis in a great matchup, and now gets an even better matchup against the LA Rams, who allow the 3rd most PPR points to the position. Odunze has some definite wide receiver 2 upside in this one right here. Moving on to the next matchup between Philadelphia and Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay running back Bucky Irving, he's the ECR running back 29. Todd Bowles has already talked about getting Irving more involved, and he's been more productive on the ground than Rachaad White. Now, the matchup isn't particularly great as Philadelphia allows the 24th most PPR points to the position, but if he sees enough volume and with the efficiency that he's had this year, he could provide an RB2 type day, especially if he were to get in the end zone here. Moving on to the next matchup, the New England Patriots take on the San Francisco 49ers, and I'm going back to the Jon Jennings well. Now, look, I'm not expecting 46.5 PPR points this week, but Jennings being ranked outside the wide receiver 2 range just seems a little egregious for me. He should continue to see his opportunities as a real part of this offense against a New England Patriots defense that allows the 6th most PPR points to the wide receiver position. Moving on to this next matchup, Washington against Arizona. I really was hoping to pick Austin Eckler for this one again, as I did last week, but he's dealing with a concussion and has been ruled out for this game, so he will not play. So I had to pivot last minute here, and I'm going with Arizona wide receiver Michael Wilson. He's the ECR wide receiver 54. Wilson was one of my favorite late round dart throws at the wide receiver position, just based on his production and his per rate stats last year. And he wasn't super involved in the first 2 games of the season, with just 4 combined targets, but was involved heavily in week 3, seeing 9 targets, catching 8 of them for 64 yards. Those 9 targets were good for a 26% target share. And now it seems like might be a perfect storm of things lining up here for Wilson in week 4, as Trey McBride is unlikely to play as he's in concussion protocol. And then Marvin Harrison Jr. has popped up as a limited participant in practice with a quad injury. Not to mention, this matchup against Washington is a great one for Wilson, as the Commanders allow the most PPR points to the wide receiver position this season. Moving on to the next matchup, Kansas City against the LA Chargers. And give me Carson Steele again. He's the ECR running back 28. Kansas City Chiefs running back Carson Steele, that is. Steele didn't make big noise in terms of fantasy output in his first start against Atlanta, but the peripherals were all there for us. He saw the volume we expected him to see and even got some goal line opportunities as well. And now, while the matchup isn't great, the situation is, as the Kansas City Chiefs are 8.5-point favorites against a LA Chargers offense that might not have Justin Herbert on the other side. And then they're missing Derwin James, who's potentially, he's suspended for this game, but he's a big part of what they do defensively. So I like Carson Steele this week again. Let's start him as an RB2 with some major confidence this week. Moving on to the next matchup between Cleveland and the Las Vegas Raiders. I'm going with Cleveland quarterback Deshaun Watson, ECR quarterback 25. Watson's been up and down through 3 games, but now gets to face a Las Vegas defense that's allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to the quarterback position, having allowed at least 17 fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks in their last 2 matchups, just getting ripped apart by Andy Dalton just last week. And I know it's tough to trust Watson with his performance, not just this year, but even last year in Cleveland, and I believe even the year before that, towards the end of the year. But this matchup is really good, and I think it's one that's worth attacking, especially if you play in 2 quarterback leagues. I think you have to play Watson, but in those 1 quarterback leagues, depending on what your situation is, this might be a guy that you would want to throw out there, especially in deeper leagues. Moving on to the next game here, the Buffalo Bills against the Baltimore Ravens. Going with my guy again, and you got to get some respect. Buffalo wide receiver Khalil Shakir, ECR wide receiver 34. I will not stand for this disrespect of Khalil Shakir, the PPR wide receiver 17 on the year through 3 games. He's not a flashy player or a flashy name, but he's got at least 5 catches and 50 yards or a touchdown in each of his 3 games this season, accomplishing both in week 3 against Jacksonville. he's got a safe floor, but he's also got a ceiling with him being attached to Josh Allen. And now gets to face a Ravens defense that allows the fourth most PPR points to the position. And specifically, if you remember how Rashee Rice and the Kansas City Chiefs were able to attack this Ravens defense in the middle of the field, I'm willing to start Khalil Shakir with some confidence as a wide receiver 2 with some wide receiver 1 upside here. Moving on to the next matchup, the Tennessee Titans against the Miami Dolphins. And a guy who's basically been a regular on this segment, Tennessee running back Tony Pollard. He's the ECR running back 21. Again, basically a regular in this segment that didn't come through last week. But did we choose him last week? I don't think we chose him last week. I think he was ineligible last week because he was inside that top 20. But he didn't come through last week. But he's in a great matchup this week against the Miami Dolphins, who allow the 6th most PPR points to the running back position. This game might be ugly, but it will be close, which means Pollard should have his share of opportunities in this game. And last but not least, the Seattle Seahawks against the Detroit Lions. And I'm going with a guy who's kind of tough to trust, but got to call our shots. Seattle wide receiver Jackson Smith-Njigba. He's the ECR wide receiver 25. He's been hard to predict this year. Had 16 targets in week 2, but a combined 5 targets in weeks 1 and 3. This game should be high scoring with some back and forth nature to it. The matchup is really good here as well, as the Detroit Lions allow the 2nd most PPR points to the wide receiver position. Now, again, tough to trust, but I feel like we've got to call our shots here, and you could do worse than starting a player like Jackson Smith-Njigba, who had 16 targets in week 2. And I don't know if that's like, does it feel like we're chasing something there? I don't know, but I'm not willing to have that production on my bench potentially this week in week 4. So as I mentioned, y'all, that is really all I have for week 4. I wish I could have used this opportunity to take some questions, especially considering that we kind of flew through this. But, like I said, this is pre-recorded. I have, a trip that I have to take this weekend. So unfortunately couldn't do the Friday morning usual time slot, but you are still getting this show Friday morning, 7 a.m. Eastern, right? So again, be mindful of any injury concerns, any injury concerns that might pop up, any weather concerns that might pop up, and how that will impact some of the things that I said in this matchup show here. So that being said, y'all, have a good one. Make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel or have those notifications on, whether it's on Twitch, X, Instagram, or make sure you're subscribed on the podcast platforms, wherever you get your podcast. And if you can help the show out, give a like, give a subscribe, give a comment. Really helps the show out a lot and doesn't cost you anything. And helps us bump up in those algorithms. So appreciate y'all. Have a good one, and make sure you're following the Instagram accounts as well at @therealjonj_FF and at FFDX. Have a good one, y'all. We'll talk later. Peace.